Good afternoon. In today's presentation, we're going to talk about the white paper of 1969, represented by Mahmoud Ali and Sophia.
The relationship between Canadian government and the indigenous population of Canada was regulated by different legal norms and acts, which had quite adverse effects on the life of the indigenous population. At this point, it is possible to refer to the White Paper of 1969. The White Paper of 1969 was a very controversial initiative of the federal government of Canada, which had good intentions but which evoked strong criticism from the part of the First Nations and Indigenous FNMI, people of Canada, and their leaders. In spite of the declared attempts to create the just society, the White Paper of 1969 threatened the autonomy of FNMI people because of the White Paper intended to end the special legal relationship between Canadian government and FNMI people.
Canadian government presented this step as a beneficial for FNMI, and as a great respect, Canadian government would pay for the indigenous population of Canada. However, what Canadian government left behind the scene and hid from the public eye was possible consequences of the proposed policy that aimed at the integration of FNMI people into Canadian society, as FNMI community would become a part of Canada without any legal conventionality and restrictions that existed before, and were established by the Indian Act and other legal norms.
Therefore, regardless of good intentions, the White Paper of 1969 was rather a sophisticated assault of Canadian government onto the anatomy of FNMI people and preservation of their authentic culture and way of life.
The 1969 White Paper is known as Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy 1969. It was a Canadian government policy paper that worked to remove the last Indigenous-related legal documents. For example, the Indian Act and Agreements. The policy was intended to abolish previous legal documents relating to Indigenous people in Canada. It also aimed to eliminate treaties and assimilate all Indians fully into the Canadian state. Presenting the White Paper in 1969, Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, Jean Sheraton, and Prime Minister Pierre Elliott proposed to deal with Indigenous issues definitely. Until the 1960s, the corruption of settlers has had devastating consequences for Indigenous peoples across Canada. Almost all populations have been diminished by up to 90% owing to widespread disease, disruptions of food production and food routes, conflict, and industrial development. There are things that led to the White Paper. In the 1960s, the federal government could no longer argue that the Aboriginal peoples created a big socio-economic challenge that includes high poverty and child mortality rates than non-Indigenous Canadians, also shorter life expectancy and academic achievement. In 1963, the federal government commissioned University of British Columbia anthropologist Harry B. Hawthorne to investigate the social conditions of Aboriginal peoples across Canada. Moreover, the civil rights that affected the United States introduced national attention to the widespread racism and prejudice that African Americans and what other communities face. The movement also led many Canadians to question inequality and discrimination in their own society, particularly the treatment of First Nations.
Negative effects of the White Paper became obvious immediately and caused the strong opposition from the part of FNMI leaders. The Aboriginal response to the White Paper was post-colonial, in that it marked a clear movement towards the reconstitution of Aboriginal identities by Aboriginal people as a taking back from control over Aboriginal minds, bodies, and spirits. Fitzmaurice 74. Fitzmaurice views of the White Paper of 1969 as a marker of aboriginal distrust and suspicion of ongoing state colonial tendencies. The white paper undermined the confidence of FNMI in the Canadian government and revived fears the Canadian government would attempt to abuse rights of FNMI. Current issues faced by FNMI people and communities are diverse, and they are rather negative than positive for the Indigenous people of Canada. To put it more precisely, the White Paper of 1969 promoted the inclusion and integration of FNMI people, but such approach rather accelerated their assimilation of Canadian society and enhanced the disintegration of their traditional culture and way of life. This trend still persists, and the idea of the further integration of FNMI into Canadian society is still popular in Canada, regardless of negative cultural and civilizational effects of such policy on FNMI people.
Therefore, today, there is the urgent need to correct the mistakes that haunt Canada to this day, including mistakes associated with the White Paper of 1969. The concept of interrogation of FNMI people into Canadian society apparently questions their uniqueness and anatomy of FNMI people. Moreover, the idea of interrogation of FNMI people into Canadian society is a direct threat to FNMI culture and way of life. This is a major mistake associated with the White Paper of 1969. Instead, contemporary policies should rather focus on the support of the preservation of the authentic way of life of FNMI people and their culture through granting them wider anatomy and restricting possible interference of Canadian government and authorities into FNMI communities and their way of life. Instead of the idea of interrogation, Canadian society and policymakers should rather encourage the idea of one nation, many cultures that would distinguish FNMI people and their culture from that one mainstream part of Canadian society.
Thank you for listening.